Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Oliver Kerr, head of Aurora's North American business, and I'm really excited about today's episode. My guest today is Michael Terrell, Senior Director of Energy and Climate at Google. And one of the key trends we've seen in the power sector over the past decade is the increasingly important role of corporates in the energy transition. Google naturally has been right at the heart of that, not only as a huge consumer of power, but also really playing an active role in pushing the envelope for a greener grid. It was over a decade now, back in 2012, that Google first set a goal of matching 100% of its annual power demand with zero carbon sources. They achieved that just 5 years later in 2017 and every year since then. In 2020, they set the much more ambitious goal of sourcing 24/7 carbon-free energy on every grid where Google operates. Effectively, what that means is hour-to-hour matching of Google's consumption with clean local power. It's an ambitious goal, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the man responsible for delivering it. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, as Global Director of Energy and Climate, you have a central role in Google's efforts to reduce emissions. Before we get into some of the nitty-gritty, can you talk a little bit about how Google's energy and climate practice is structured? What are some of the key areas of focus?
Sure. And let me first just talk about my role, which is I have responsibility over our 24/7 carbon-free energy and net zero goals. Obviously, those are company-wide goals, and I lead a team that works across the company to develop roadmaps and solutions on energy and carbon. We also work actually more broadly to drive market transformation that we're going to need to actually achieve these goals. Before I took on the role I have now, I sat within our data center operations teams where I led energy strategy at Google for a number of years, including building out our efforts on 24/7 carbon-free energy. We actually have a lot of touch points on energy across the company. In our data center operations, in our buildings group, in our supply chain group, in our product areas. And I work very closely with all of those teams.
Great. So the point on data centers is actually a good one to start with. So we hear a lot about power demand from data centers. So before we get into the detail, can you just spell out for listeners exactly what a data center is and how much power do they actually consume?
Yeah, so data centers, they're the engines behind the digital services that power the internet. For us at Google, it's services like Google Cloud, Search, Maps, Workspace, and as well as our ongoing innovation in AI and ML. If you I would think of a data center as a building with many computer servers. These can be large campuses, smaller sites, or even co-location spaces where we rent space from others. And the servers provide services for all of our products, storage, compute, capacity, and they're networked across many, many thousands of computers. These sites they can range in terms of their energy use. They can range from, single-digit megawatts to hundreds of megawatts in range. But they are really, the engines of the internet is the way I describe them.
Yeah, so a really interesting aspect to the 24/7 goal is that it's really a moving target. Our lives are increasingly online. We want more storage, more speed. We have to train AI algorithms. So how much demand growth can we expect from data centers over the coming decade, not just in Google, but globally?
Yeah, it's hard to predict the future. If you look at Google's portfolio now, in 2022, we consumed about 21 terawatt hours of electricity across our global fleet. That would be about 4 times as much electricity as the city of San Francisco uses. And that was to provide, all of our services across the board. Obviously, we're starting to layer in more AI support. But if you look, sort of backwards, our electricity demand has grown roughly 20% year over year, as growth in the internet has continued to grow around the world. And, we'll expect to continue to, invest in data centers and servers to serve the demands of the internet and our users.
Yeah, 20 terawatt hours is actually smaller than I expected for the backbone of the internet, but that the rate of growth is phenomenal. So, one of the biggest news stories of last year, 2023, was the emergence of AI again in the form of large language models. So how big of a deal is training ML models in terms of power consumption?
Yeah. Historically for us, it's been only a portion of our broader electricity portfolio. There was a paper that was released in 2022 that estimates that cloud and hyperscale data centers are responsible for about 0.1 to 0.2% of global GHG emissions. And that roughly, I think in that same paper, it said roughly 25% of data center workloads are related to ML learning. So that's not inconsistent with what we've seen. What's interesting is we're continuing to work to optimize, how we manage our own ML compute. It's still really early days, but I'm really encouraged by the improvements that we're driving to minimize our footprint there. We've been able to reduce the energy required to train an AI model by up to 100 times and reduce the associated emissions by up to 1,000 times. So, obviously we're trying to make these capabilities as efficient as possible. And I think we're just at the beginning of some of the advances that we're going to see there. And then just more broadly, if you just look at our data center fleet as a whole, it's, we operate these fleets super efficiently. A Google owned and operated data center is, on average about 1.5 times as energy efficient as the typical enterprise data center. We have very low PUE numbers, and we're continuing to drive efficiencies, and I expect that trend to continue.
And that's also an interesting challenge in that the more efficient something is, the more we're able to use it. And I'm curious actually on that point on operations about the flexibility of data center demand. So, one of the key features of data centers as the backbone of the internet is we really can't do without them. So, that's why they have not just backup power, but backup for the backup. So how feasible is it to, shift down consumption either to a different time of day to another data center somewhere else, effectively to flex that load up or down or across space to match hourly changes in power supply on a given grid?
Yeah, no, I think this is, one of the more interesting things that we've seen in recent years. Of course, data centers operate around the clock, but we're starting to see opportunities to flex our electricity loads. And in part, a lot of it was driven by our 24/7 carbon-free energy goals, which I know we'll talk about. But yeah, we've now developed a way to actually, utilize demand response in our data centers. So shift some of the non-urgent compute tasks to other times and locations, and doing that in a way that doesn't impact our own services or the people that rely on us every day. Since 2020, we've been doing what we call carbon intelligent computing, which is that we actually shift our compute loads to times and places for when the electricity grids are the cleanest. And so I think these are still, new capabilities that we're building out, but they are of tremendous value to grid operators, who are looking for every tool they can find to help them operate reliably and efficiently. And, most data centers are large energy loads. And so having that flexibility is not only incredibly valuable for us from a cost savings and energy and carbon standpoint, it's super invaluable for grid operators.
And that's on the operation side. How much flexibility do you actually have in siting the data centers to begin with? So, I suppose what's to stop you from building or focusing new build in the cleanest jurisdictions you can find? Presumably there's some geographic constraints there in where you can build.
It's a great question, and we have a lot of factors that go into where and how we site data centers, including cost, the availability of labor, our proximity to our users, And we certainly look at the carbon mix of the grids where we operate as part of a part of those inputs. I actually am, as a clean energy wonk, I actually am more interested in the dirty places, as strange as that sounds, because it gives us so much opportunity to really drive change. I'll just give you one example. We sited a data center on the site of a retiring coal plant in North Alabama. And as part of that deal, we required the utility to bring on large amounts of renewable power onto that grid, which was a grid that had traditionally not had a lot of non-hydro renewables. So yes, we do look for cleaner sites, but sometimes the sites that are still on the journey provide a lot of opportunity for us to affect change and help drive some of the grid transformation that we're all hoping to see.
And I think that's actually a very nice segue to talking about the 24/7 carbon-free energy goal. So perhaps just let's start with some definitions to get everybody on the same page. So what does the 24/7 goal actually mean?
Yeah, well, Oliver, you said it well at the top of the podcast. It's it really means that we want to match the electricity that we're consuming in our data centers and our offices with carbon-free electricity, in every grid where we operate in every hour of the day. And we're aiming to achieve that in 2030.
So to me, the time part of that is fairly clear. So, in every hour, you want 100% clean power to match demand. Can you talk a little bit more about the geographic element? Because that feels a little bit less clear to me. So let's say for a data center in Virginia, does the clean power have to come from, within the state specifically? Could it be within the RTOs or PJM more broadly? The US as a whole? What are some of the constraints or the ways you think about that?
Yeah, no, great question. And, it does mean purchasing clean electricity on the same grid or, what we call the same balancing authority where the consumption occurs, so where our facilities are located. And just as you indicated, grid boundaries are defined differently across different regions and countries. In some places it's national boundaries, like in a lot of countries in Europe and Asia. In other places, it's maybe a specific utilities territory. So, for example, that coal plant data center example that I gave, that's on the Tennessee Valley Authority's grid, which spans across 8 states. And then there's also regional grids, especially in the U.S. with RTOs and ISOs. So it does depend on where you are, but we really look to try to locate where we're actually where the power is being balanced in a real-time nature, according to the regulatory reliability standards.
So in the US context, if it's in a specific RTO, the target would effectively be that RTO.
That's right.
Got it. That makes sense. And so in terms of why Google is pursuing this goal, and maybe just to play devil's advocate for a moment. So a rational economist might argue from a climate perspective, it doesn't really matter where emissions reductions come from. Every ton's equal when it comes to meeting climate goals. So given that the most effective way to reduce emissions would be to focus on those with the lowest marginal cost. So, to put that in English, where's the biggest bang for my buck? So in practical terms, what you'd want to do is procure something like the cheapest wind and solar, hydro, batteries, whatever it is, no matter where it is, and no matter whether its profile matches your own consumption. So 24/7 almost flips that on its head, and Google's very explicitly saying, we're not shying away from higher marginal cost reductions in local grids. So what's the rationale behind that approach specifically?
Yeah, well, we've taken on this approach not just because we're trying to solve for Google, but we're trying to transform electricity grids around the world. And we have found that this goal really helps to orient us and others more towards that. I have to give you a little bit of history, Oliver, which I think helps provide context for why we actually did set the goal. And one of the benefits of being at Google as long as I've been is that I've been part of just about every energy effort that we've made, of any consequence. And we've always had a really strong interest in decarbonizing our power supply. It was really like early days of Google, the most obvious element of the company's carbon footprint. And starting in 2007, we started purchasing carbon offsets because that was really the only tool available at the time. You couldn't put enough wind or solar. You couldn't put enough solar on the rooftop of a data center to sort of cover the electricity consumption of it. So we pioneered the corporate power purchase agreements and started going directly to wind and solar developers and signing deals. We set the 100% renewable energy goal, as you talked about, and we achieved that in 5 years, which was much, much sooner than I thought we would. And we were really concerned at the time that we achieved the 100% annual matching goal, that people would think we were done. and it's just a step along the journey. And the next step after matching all of your electricity consumption annually with real renewable energy purchases is to start focusing on the full hourly and locational decarbonization. And so that's what led us to the 24/7 goal. It was really sort of the next step in our clean energy journey. What's been most interesting since we set the goal for Google is that is seeing how it's actually playing out in the ecosystem. One of the challenges with companies just going to where they could find, to your point about the lowest marginal cost, one of the problems with companies all going to the same place where they could find the cheap renewable energy was that we were oversaturating markets, like, for example, the Southwest Power Pool in the United States, with cheap wind purchases, which were actually driving negative pricing in the region. So what we were seeing was that, and then the marginal additional megawatt that you were adding in that situation wasn't really leading to real decarbonization opportunities. So we wanted to focus the efforts of companies more towards where they could deliver stronger reductions, and more importantly too, want to look at the broader ecosystem of, like, what will it take to get the grids where we operate to carbon free. And that involves regulatory intervention, partnering with utility companies, pressuring utility companies to change their power mixes. And if you're only taking the corporate PPA approach, where you'll just go sign PPAs in the cheapest place you can find, you're not incentivized to do those other things that are really what's needed to drive the transformation that we all want to see. And so those were some of the factors that went into our decision.
No, and I think it's a great point, and I think it really speaks to the scale of the challenge. It's, we really do have to clean up every grid, and at some point you run out of those low marginal cost emissions reductions. It almost feels like the ecosystem or the market has to catch up in some ways. It's, even with markets that have RECs, it's a very blunt instrument. The time value of low carbon power is effectively the same in every hour. Even if you already have more wind and solar in the system than the grid can handle. So, similarly for you at Google, it's not as if you get a whole lot more cred for the time matching of emissions reductions, compared to simply the, annual matching of your total consumption. So are there changes in emissions accounting or standards that you think we need to, better recognize that, a megawatt of low carbon power, they're not all created equal?
That's correct. And one of the first things we noticed when we started trying to track our portfolio on a 24/7 basis was that the accounting systems weren't set up to do that. For example, the registries that register renewable energy credits were only doing annual accounting. They weren't set up to do hourly accounting. And so one of the first things that we started doing was partnering with registries like MRETs in the United States or registries in Europe and South America to start to pilot these hourly tracking approaches. We joined an organization called Energy Tag, which is developing principles and guidance on how to structure these hourly certificates to help get that more accepted across the industry. And we're seeing a lot of momentum now in that direction, and a lot of uptake in more of these approaches. It does still need to translate to other areas. And, you asked about emissions accounting. The carbon accounting rules under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol were a huge driver in companies making these power purchase agreements. I mean, it's helped to drive 150 gigawatts of new renewable energy agreements, by companies across the world. But it was also set up over a decade ago. And the accounting system allows companies to zero out their scope 2 footprints with, for example, unbundled renewable energy purchases that don't necessarily happen in the exact place where the company has operations. And so, it doesn't necessarily translate to the reductions that are really happening. And so we do need to see accounting systems move into more of a granular space to be able to sort of capture more accurately the savings that are being driven by companies. But we're confident that that's going to happen, and there's been a lot of really positive developments on that space around the world.
So the market's catching up, but I suppose still at a very basic level, the reason 24/7 is hard is because there just isn't always enough green power on any particular grid in every hour. So how do you at Google think about filling those gaps in hours where there just isn't enough wind, solar, hydro, nuclear to meet demand?
Yeah, so there's three ways to address this, actually. The first one is just how you actually design the market. So we talked about balancing authorities and power grids. Well, just change the boundaries of the power grids, make them more regional in scope. So if you have a power grid that's spread out across several US states, for example, it's much more capable of managing the variability that you see with wind and solar and balancing across the region. So regional market design is the first way to approach this. The second is, we've also talked about this as well, having more flexible demand, having your demand more closely match the supply of clean energy on the grid. And that's something that we've now been doing at Google for the last 3 years through our Carbon Intelligent Compute program, actually changing the way we do our compute at Google, shifting it in location or shifting it in time based on what the forecast we're getting is for clean energy on the grid. And then lastly, look at the generation technologies themselves, employ more of these firm dispatchable technologies like geothermal or advanced nuclear, look at options like long duration storage. We've partnered on it with a company called Fervo on one of the first corporate geothermal projects in the world in Nevada, that looks at using new drilling techniques to get more production out of geothermal fields. And so, that's much more of an always on type of power source. So that's another area where we can help to address the variability of wind and solar.
And yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, and the first point around markets, it's frankly bizarre to me that in the United States, 40% of power is still supplied by vertically integrated monopoly utilities. So expanding the role of markets and increasing, the area served by balancing authorities and connecting markets feels extremely important in this space. On the technology front, a lot of the modeling that we've done at Aurora, I think in most places, getting to 70-80% clean energy is very much doable at a reasonable cost with existing technologies. What's really hard is that last 10 or 20%. So in terms of when your focus on the technology side, how much do you think we can rely on existing technologies versus, how much do we really need to push the thinking forward on new solutions like CCS, hydrogen, long duration storage, those sorts of things?
We need to connect your experts and the experts here at Google together, because they're thinking on the same wavelength here, which is that our own internal modeling shows something very similar, that wind and solar will only get you so far, and you really do need to start to layer on some of these other technologies as you get into the higher penetrations of carbon-free energy. And what's interesting is that actually, if you start to layer on these technologies, which are quote unquote more expensive now, they drive down your overall costs. So for example, our own modeling, when we included these advanced carbon-free energy technologies, it showed that it would reduce the cost of achieving a 90% carbon-free portfolio by nearly 40%, than just relying on wind, solar, and lithium ions alone. And for 100% carbon-free energy, the cost savings would be even greater. So I think that's a really interesting finding. I think you're seeing people like yourselves and utilities also recognize the importance of these technologies in helping to sort of round out what wind and solar and lithium ion storage are providing, and so they're hugely important.
I think that's a great point. And on this cost piece, so we work with a lot of energy execs and companies. They want to develop new sources of clean power, things like CCS, like thermal, like long duration storage. They know there's value to low carbon dispatchable generation that could fill in some of those gaps from wind and solar. Clearly, there's value to Google in reducing the overall cost of energy consumption that's clean. But that value isn't necessarily reflected in market price signals. So how do you at Google think about the value of those sorts of power sources? Presumably it's higher than the megawatt hour of wind and solar, but it's also not infinite. So how do you think about the trade-off between cost and getting to those more ambitious levels of emissions reduction?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, we're going to need to structure new utility tariffs that fully capture the value of these technologies and fully capture what this portfolio approach looks like. The good news is that we've done that in the past. The corporate clean energy demand really pushed the movement towards green tariffs or green utility tariffs in the United States. And this is really just the next phase of that, which is finding better ways to value these technologies and value the importance that they play towards the grid and rounding out the wind and solar and lithium-ion storage. And so, we've been partnering with others in the regulatory space on something called a clean transition tariff, which would be a new tariff structure that actually vertically integrated utilities can employ that will help to value these clean energies appropriately.
I think that makes a lot of sense in the regulated markets. In competitive ISOs, are there other solutions there, or is it just it feels a lot harder?
Yeah, and I think that's where things like the IRA and other policy mechanisms can help to get some of these technologies deployed. And then as you start to deploy them at scale, it'll help to drive those costs down and address some of those issues. But that's also something I think we have to look at from an RTO market perspective. What incentives are needed beyond what's already been provided by the IRA to help get these technologies deployed?
So I think we've started to dance around this a little bit, but I'm interested in the theory of change. So for Google to be able to succeed in 24/7, almost by definition, you need a zero carbon grid everywhere. Clearly you have a major role as a large consumer of energy, but beyond procurement, what levers does Google have to influence that broader system change at a high level?
Yeah, and I think if you relied on every company to sign PPAs as they do now, that's not going to get us there. Like ultimately the way every company like Google gets to clean power 24/7 is just to have the power grids get there first, or get there for everybody. We might get there first in our case, and a few others might as well. But we're doing our damnedest to try to get the power grids to come with us. So yeah, I sort of see us as having three levers, and the first lever is procurement, and that's the one that I think unfortunately gets 90% of the attention because the other two levers are super important. But procurement is how we craft deals with utilities or energy sellers, and we've been structuring deals to have more of a portfolio approach. Second, of course, is technology. We talked about that. There's a slew of new carbon-free energy technologies that are just waiting to be deployed at scale that I think are much closer to that than we've ever been in terms of looking beyond wind, solar, and storage. And then lastly is policy, and that arguably is probably the most important lever when it comes to grid transformation. And it's something that's really important to us. We've been very active on policy for years. We actually released a paper that provided a policy roadmap for 24/7 carbon-free energy, and it's something that we see as incredibly important. Again, not just for us to reach our goal, but to really get power grids to 24/7 as well.
So the policy paper was put out back in 2022, and listeners should definitely go and check it out. I think it's a really interesting read. Since then, we've had the Inflation Reduction Act, which you mentioned. So, in effect, this is concerted industrial policy to green the grid. It actually includes many of the incentives that Google had previously advocated for in the policy paper. So, are we done now, or what's still missing from your perspective on the policy front that you'd really like to see?
Yeah, well, the IRA was a huge step change. I mean, the dog caught the car finally for those of us who had been advocating for clean energy incentives for all these years. But the way I would describe it is that, now with the IRA, everybody gets a heavy discount on a car, but we're still not building any roads, so we still have this incredible demand for clean energy, but we've got plenty of roadblocks that are still in place to keep it from getting deployed at scale and as quickly as that needs to happen. So, obviously we've got to solve for transmission and interconnection problems. That's been a huge barrier recently to getting clean energy on the grid and getting it on the grid quickly and at scale. I mean, it blows my mind that we look at deals now and it could be, 3 or 4 years before we can get those projects built and online for a deal that we would sign tomorrow, for example. So this is a huge barrier, and it's going to continue to be a barrier if we don't address it, because the IEA has predicted that, electricity demand is going to triple by 2050 because of the move to electrification and increases in demand and all of that. So that's a big one. And then just market structures. We've talked a little bit about that. We need more regional competitive energy markets in the U.S. We should have an RTO in every region in the United States. We should look at the vertical integration model and how can we improve upon that through things like clean transition tariffs or other policies. So we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to market design. And then lastly, these voluntary signals. We talked a little bit about the greenhouse gas accounting protocols. Those are really important to driving private investment in carbon-free technologies, and so making sure that those kinds of signals are steering corporate investment in the right places that are going to drive the greatest transformation is another one that is completely removed from the IRA, but is still super important.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And we're still getting announcements on the IRA. One where we've had a big one recently was in the hydrogen space. I think this really mirrors some of the discussions we've been having around 24/7. So one of the questions at stake, as I'm sure some of our listeners will have been following, is whether to qualify for the 45V tax credit, electrolyzers will have to match their demand with renewables on an hourly basis. And it looks like the IRS is going to come down more stringent on that than many people expected and require that hourly matching. There are some that say that the proposed regulation is too ambitious. It'll cripple a nascent hydrogen industry. Others say, no, it's important that we keep standards high from the outset. Is that something that you have a view on at Google?
Yeah, and I have to tell you, when we really moved work forward on 24/7 carbon-free energy, we never would have dreamed that it would touch areas like this. Another area where I have responsibility over at Google is our work around carbon removals. And it's very similar to hydrogen, where some of these direct air capture technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere require a lot of electricity. And how do you verify that the electricity that you're using to run what's going to be something that's helping the climate is actually clean? I think it's a huge challenge, and I'm just very grateful that we've built out the 24/7 architecture and tracking and monitoring mechanisms that are going to allow us to verify this, because I wonder where we would be if we didn't have those capabilities. I mean, because the research has been very clear that in the case of hydrogen, if you just used annual renewable energy matching to try to verify whether or not your electrolyzers are using green electricity, it's actually going to increase emissions. So it would be a huge bummer to spend billions of dollars of subsidies from the IRA and have it actually not contribute to driving down greenhouse gas emissions. So from our perspective, it's really important to get this right, number one. And then number two, the capabilities are there. Like I talked about, like the tracking, the registries, all of that is being built out. We're using that for ourselves now. And then lastly, the policies that you're seeing in places like Europe and what's been proposed in the US, provide for a period, a glide path for making the switch. So they're not sort of flipping a switch and saying, okay, you have to track hourly starting tomorrow. They're giving a multi-year path to actually continue to build out these capabilities. so that they'll be in place, when hydrogen producers will need to use them. But you've seen a strong support from a number of players in the hydrogen industry, including the largest hydrogen producer in the world, Air Products, for taking this approach where you track hourly and locational, because they want their product to be rock solid.
No, completely agree. And it's interesting to see the 24/7 sort of thinking or philosophy play out in all of these different spaces. I think that's a great place to wrap up. And one of the ways that we sometimes like to wrap up these episodes is with a quick fire round of under or overrated. So I'm going to list 4 things, and you're going to tell me if you think they are under or overrated, with a very brief explanation if you would like to, but no pressure. So the first is the role of corporates in the energy transition.
That one's underrated for sure. We have 150 gigawatts of corporate PPAs now, and we're just getting started. I chair the board of an organization called the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, which is made up of companies that are trying to use clean energy to zero out their Scope 2 emissions. And we have over 400 members now. It's quadrupled, I think, in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'd like to see that number grow to 4,000 or even 40,000. So I think this is a huge lever and one that's just beginning.
Right, 150 gigawatts is a huge number. The second is the role of carbon pricing in reducing emissions.
Still the most efficient way to address climate change, according to economists, but not the only way. And there's many other tools like the IRA, the market reforms we talked about, that can help us get us there. If you look at the United States, clean energy policies have gotten us much further than carbon policies in the past 20 years. There's been a much broader base of support. So even though, from an economic perspective, carbon pricing is the most efficient, some of these other levers that we've put to play are real important too and have gotten us a long way.
So it sounds like an overrated. The last 2 are technology focused. So the third one is CCS. So carbon capture and storage is a low carbon source of power.
I'm going to hedge here and say TBD, but we shouldn't take anything off the table. But it's going to have to be able to be deployed cost effectively and safely at scale, and we've yet to see that.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And the last one is hydrogen as a carbon solution.
Again, TBD, I suppose. We shouldn't be taking any of these solutions off the table. We feel strongly about that. Whether it's hydrogen or CCS or advanced nuclear, long duration storage. And frankly, on these last 2, if any one of them, and including the others like advanced nuclear or long duration storage or geothermal, like if any one of those has the success that we've seen with wind and solar in the past decade, it'll be a game changer. So let's hope we see it.
Likewise. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So thank you to everyone for tuning in. And Michael, thank you so much for being here today.
Great. Thanks, Oliver, for having me.
That was Oliver Kerr, head of Aurora's North American business, talking to Michael Terrell, Senior Director of Energy and Climate at Google. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.